When I was a junior in high school, I anticipated going to Moody College in downtown Chicago. I I've always loved cities, and I spent a lot of my formative years in Southern California in the city. And so when my parents and I were looking at colleges, I thought, I like this Moody thing. And I spent all my senior year getting ready to go to Moody. And then actually 5 weeks after I graduated from high school, my dad accepted a job at what is now Crown College, used to be called St. Paul Bible College. He accepted a job as the dean. And, guess what? You know, the dean's kid could go tuition free if you lived at home. Well, that solved that. You know, there was no question then. So I attended and went to St. Paul Bible College, now called Crown College. It's a part of the church family, the wider family that we're a part of. And because I'd registered so late, I didn't get a lot of choice in classes or schedule or anything like that. And I saw on my schedule that I was just presented with that I had a class in the philosophy of religion, and it was taught by a man by the name of Dr. John Gates. And I found a picture of him online. It's not, it doesn't give you the full effect, because Dr. Gates was born with muscular dystrophy. He was confined to a wheelchair. His arms were like little sticks. He had horrible, horrible buck teeth. He spoke with a huge speech impediment. And if you were in his class, you had to work really hard to understand him, because he talked with that speech impediment in order to pronounce words. And in philosophy, there are a lot of big words. In order to pronounce words, he would soften his voice, because it was harder to get enough air to speak those big words very loudly with very much volume. And the first few classes were tough. They were just tough. But as the other freshmen in that class began to understand very quickly, this was a brilliant guy. And I took every class I could after that first experience with him. Took every class I could with him because, well, he was brilliant, and I learned a lot from him. One of the funny things, and he was always looking to make jokes, he was always laughing. He had the greatest outlook on life that you could possibly imagine. And he announced one day that his birthday was the same birthday as Lee Iacocca. Now, some of you don't even know that name, but some of you would remember that name as the guy who rescued Chrysler Motor Company. But what Lee Iacocca was really famous for in 1972, when I was a freshman in college, was he was famous for the Mustang. He was the guy that led the team that designed and marketed the Mustang. And, Dr. Gates would joke with us, do any of you have a Mustang? Are you going to give me a ride in your Mustang? Is it a convertible Mustang? I mean, he was just enthralled with the idea of riding in a Mustang. But I tell that story to tell you that my first visual impression of Dr. Gates was what was I going to learn from this crippled old guy? And I'm just being honest. That's what I thought. A crippled old guy who could hardly talk. And yet, I learned a lot. The visual impression was not very accurate. And we deal a lot with those visual impressions, don't we? I mean, I started driving when Volkswagen, had this little cheap car that wasn't much to look at. It looked like, somebody burped. And the thing about them is, you sat on a plastic seat. There was no carpet on the floor. It was manual transmission. The back seat was literally a piece of plywood covered with vinyl. There was no padding on the back seat at all. And it was a fun little car to drive for a brand new driver. But we couldn't help but compare it to the Jaguar that was also available. Because now that's a car, right? And our immediate visual comparison between the Volkswagen and the Jaguar, wow, I mean, any day. Give me a ride in that convertible, and that would just be great. A friend, several of my friends, work at a pastor's retreat center in Roan Mountain, Tennessee, way in the northeastern end of Tennessee. And they have several cabins that are available for pastors and missionaries to stay in and rest for a week to 10 days. And I mean, this is beautiful setting, absolutely gorgeous place. It is, they have developed this property in incredible ways. But it's really interesting because on the road that leads into their development, you pass this mess. And if you haven't been there before or haven't been on their website to see pictures, you're thinking, I'm going to stay in that? Because, they've advertised that these are rustic cabins and you're going to experience some of that kind of life. And, my friends, we are so incredibly dependent on our visual sense, aren't we? We are so dependent on that. I remember a student of culture who's now died. He's with Jesus. And a Jesus follower. And he said in the late 80s, he says, the next generation is going to transform us into a generation that listens with their eyes and thinks with their feelings. And I just kind of brushed it off. Now I have a kind of a mini poster printed with those words on it that I see every time I look at my bookcase above my study or above my desk in my study at home. Because we listen with our eyes and we think with our feelings. It's true. We've become a culture that does that. But hardly anybody reads anymore. They might buy an audiobook, but hardly anybody reads a book anymore. And it's just this constant reminder that if we're basing our opinions about people, if we're coming to conclusions because of what we see, if we're making a decision on the value of a person based on how they look all crippled up in a wheelchair, speaking with a speech impediment, if we're choosing between a Volkswagen and a Jaguar, we do this visual comparison all the time. And it gets us in trouble all the time. It gets me in trouble. And maybe nobody else gets in trouble doing that. Maybe I'm the only one with that problem. Maybe I'm the one that needs this message more than anybody else. But I come to the Old Testament story about three men, Samuel and Saul and David. Now these three men are embroiled in a story that literally spans decades. But we're going to remind ourselves of the story in just a few paragraphs. Samuel was God's prophet over the people of Israel. He spoke for Israel, or he spoke for God to the people of Israel. And the people of Israel wanted to be like everybody else. Oh man, that's so much like what we fall into the trap of doing. We want to be like everybody else. And the people of Israel said to Samuel, we want a king. Everybody else around us has a king. All these tribal groups and all these other people around us in the land where we live, they have a king. They have kings. We want a king. And Samuel warned them. He said, no, you really don't. And God finally spoke to Samuel and said, okay, give him a king. Last week we talked about the story of the waiting father and the son who came to his father and says, I wish you were dead to give me my share of the estate. And the father did. God gave Israel a king when they asked for a king, even though he knew it wasn't going to turn out very good. And Saul didn't turn out very good. Saul was anointed the king over Israel, and he usurped. He took upon himself the responsibility of a priest, and God says, okay, you're done. You're going to be removed. It took many years before he was removed, but he says, your family is not going to reign over this people for generations, because that's what normally happened with kings. And so then God speaks to Samuel and he says, I want you to go to Bethlehem, and there's a family there, a tribal group there called the House of Jesse. And I want you to go to Jesse's family, and I want you to anoint one of Jesse's sons to be the next king of Israel, and I'll show you who it is. So Samuel and his entourage arrive in Bethlehem, and the people are nervous. Here is the primary prophet of all their understanding of God, and he's arriving, and are we in trouble? Is God's judgment coming on us? And Samuel says, no, I'm just coming to make a sacrifice, and I'm going to do it at Jesse's house. And he goes to Jesse's house. He has Jesse call all his sons together, and they prepare to make a sacrifice. And when Samuel saw the sons coming, and when Samuel saw all these guys gathering, he saw the oldest son. And the oldest son was handsome and tall. He looked like a king. He was, the football player's football player. And he just looked like he should be king. And this is the account that we have. When they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before me. That visual reaction, that first impression controlled by our eyes. And Samuel says, surely this is God's anointed. This handsome, well-built guy. He just looks like a king. And God speaks to Samuel. And this is what he said. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. And then we come across this statement, the Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. This is a pivotal principle in Scripture. There's so much that we learn from God and about what God is going to do from this statement that God makes about himself to Samuel. And Samuel records it because it is so significant. It's so important. It's that pivotal principle in Scripture. There are other pivotal principles, but this one, man, there's so much that hangs on this one. The Lord looks at the heart. The Lord looks at the heart. And, our first reaction, if we're really honest with ourselves, our first reaction is, well, does that mean that God looks at this organ in my body that circulates blood to all my extremities? Is that what God sees? And the answer is no. That's not the heart that God is talking about. And so sometimes we mix words together, and we often use heart and soul together. And we often replace the word heart with the word soul, and we say, well, God sees my soul. Well, I want to give you a definition this morning, which I've shared before. It's a culmination of all kinds of things that have come together, and it's something that several of us pastors have worked on together to define, because we think it's important to define the heart. And you have this definition on the cards that you've received. The heart is the integrated combination, woven together, the integrated combination of our thoughts, of our emotions, and of our intentions. That's what our heart is. God sees your thoughts. He sees what you're thinking. He knows your thoughts. He looks at your life, and one of the things he sees is, what are you thinking? He looks at your life and he sees your emotions. I try to help people understand the depth of this statement, because we deal in a time right now where we have so many people, and many of you, who are dealing with depression and anxiety and paranoia, and my friends, God sees that. That's not unknown to him. He doesn't ignore that. He sees that. And he understands how integrated that is with your thoughts. And then God also sees our intentions. He knows what we're about to do. He knows what we're thinking about doing. He knows that we would like revenge. He knows our desire for fairness. Most of the time, we're not talking about justice, we're talking about fairness. We want to be treated like everybody else. Or we think everybody else ought to be treated like we're being treated. He understands our intentions. He understands how our intentions often propel us down the wrong path, into the wrong relationships, doing things we never would have done in other situations. And we find ourselves in trouble. We find ourselves in circumstances that we don't know how to get out of. We find ourselves in a situation where we know that God knows our heart. That integrated combination of our thoughts, of our emotions, and our intentions. It's why it's so important for us to understand what Jesus says to us and the disciples in Matthew. In Matthew 15:18, he says, "But the things that come out of a person's mouth come from the heart." Come from the heart. The things that we say and the things that we do come from that integrated combination of our thoughts, our emotions, and our intentions. That's where they come from. In Proverbs, one of the statements that we find is, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Everything you do flows from your heart. In the New Testament, Jesus tells an incredible story. Last week we looked at probably his most famous parable, but one of his equally famous parables involves three men: a Levite, a priest, and a Samaritan. And Jesus tells a story about a man who is traveling on the road, and some thieves, some robbers, a band of roving evildoers catches up to this guy, and they beat him up, and they take his belongings from him, and they leave him for dead all along the side of the road. And three men come along that same path, along that same road. One of them is a priest. That means that he was somebody who was actually actively involved in leading the people in worship at the temple or in a synagogue. This guy was actively a pastor. And he crosses the road, ignores the guy who's laying there all beaten up. He had better things to do, who knows? He didn't want to get involved, who knows? A Levite comes around. Now, the Levites were the tribe from whom the priests were chosen. And that's like the elders of the church. A Levite comes along, and he too ignores this man who had been beaten and left for dead. But the least likely of all the people in the story is a Samaritan. And the Samaritan, in our understanding, depending on which side of the aisle you sit, this is a Republican or a Democrat. This is an illegal alien who's crossed the border. The least likely person that you'd ever expect. This is the person who is suffering from AIDS. That's a Samaritan. Nobody liked them. Everybody stayed away from them. They were shunned and avoided. But he's the one who stops, who sets aside his plans, who changes his schedule, and he takes that man who had been beaten and robbed and left for dead, and he takes him to the next house down the road, and he says, let's clean this guy up, let's nurse him back to health, and by the way, he's going to have to stay here for a while. I will pay you any expenses that you incur for taking care of this guy. And he's the one who reaches out and does something. Jesus tells this story because he's trying to impress upon the people, who their neighbor is. In fact, that's what Jesus asks after he's done telling the story. He asks the leader, the church leader that's questioned him about it. He asks him, which of these three men do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hand of robbers? The story, Jesus' purpose in telling the story is, who is your neighbor? And the expert in the law said, well, pretty obvious. It's the one who had mercy on him. Note that in telling the story, Jesus doesn't even have, this leader of the church reply and say, well, it was the Samaritan. He wouldn't even talk about a Samaritan. Everybody avoided even talking about Samaritans. But he says, that's the one who had mercy on him. And then Jesus says, you're right, you've answered correctly. Now go and do the same thing. And here's what I want to point out in that story. In order for us to do that, in order for us to look upon the people around us as our neighbors, worthy of our mercy and our grace, we have to change our heart. Because, let's face it, there are some people we'd rather not be around. There's some people we'd rather not spend time with. There are people that we'd like to avoid. And Jesus comes along and says, no, this is your neighbor. These are all your neighbors. And for me, this relates all the way back to Samuel at the house of Jesse, when God says, look, I'm not looking for you to act the right way. I'm looking at what your heart is. What's the condition of your heart? That integrated combination of your thoughts and your emotions and your intentions. This is why it's so important that when we teach our children and our grandchildren, our teenagers and our young adults, it's not enough to act good to get to heaven or to have a relationship with God. No, it's just not. What it takes is the right kind of heart. And God transforms our hearts. He changes our hearts. That's the business that He's in, so that our thoughts and our emotions and our intentions are tuned into Him and His Spirit instead of the things of this world. Because if we rely on the things of this world, we're going to base it all on listening with our eyes and thinking with our feelings. And we're going to miss it. Paul says to the church at Philippi, when he's writing them, he says, the peace of God which transcends all understanding. And believe me, it does. And it's hard for me to explain to you the ways that I've experienced that in my life. It's really difficult. You know, the peace of God that we experience when we learn to depend on Him is transformative in ways that transcend explanation, that are beyond explanation. I mean, how do I describe to you the fact that when my wife was diagnosed with cancer and they put the x-rays or the MRI up on the screen and they showed her liver was completely filled with cancerous growths, and I walked to that 4th floor skyway at the University of Iowa City Hospital. And I sat down in that skyway on one of the ledges that I think they put there for you to sit on. And I sat down there and I called one of my best friends. I called my mentor, Doug Webster. And I said, Doug, my wife is going to die. And the minute the words came out of my mouth, I had this incredible sense of peace. Sitting in that skyway. And somehow God kept anybody else from coming on that skyway for I don't know how long, but I had this peace that I can't even explain to you that came over me. And you know what? That presence of God, that peace of God, guards our hearts and our minds. Because so much of who we are is driven by what is going on in our heart, our mind, that integrated combination of our thoughts, our emotions, and our intentions. My friends, we face an incredible challenge in a world that is divided and angry, in a world that feels like it's falling apart, in a world where it seems like violence is the first response from anybody in any kind of situation. We face a challenge to be able to look at people and see what the Samaritans saw. We face this challenge to look at people and see what God saw in David and not in Eliab when Samuel was at the house of Jesse. You know, one of my favorite lines ever of any book I've ever written is in a book about the life of David, where the author says, you know, David was plucked out of his insignificant sheep-keeping obscurity to become the most famous king who ever ruled in the world. He was plucked out of his insignificant sheep-keeping obscurity. God saw something in him that nobody else saw. What do you and I see when we look at people? What do we see when we look at other people? Do we see the possibility that God sees? Do we have the capacity for our minds and our hearts to grasp His love for those people? So my challenge for you, my challenge for us, is to begin thinking this way every day, multiple times a day. I don't know how many times that I pray this. I'm sharing with you part of what I pray every morning. I pray, give me the courage to love people and believe the best about others. There are so many situations going on in the world right now where people assume the worst instead of the best. I'm telling you, my friends, that is the core problem that we have between Ukraine and Russia, between the Hamas and Israel, between Hezbollah and Israel, between Iran and Israel. Between China and Taiwan. Nobody is willing to believe the best about somebody. They always believe the worst. The initial assumption, the knee-jerk reaction is to believe the worst. So, God, give me the courage to love people and believe the best about others, and give me eyes to see others as you see them, and grace and mercy towards them that overflows. That's our response of obedience to the person that we claim to be our Lord, our Master, our King, the conductor of our lives. That's our response. That's the proper response. And it's hard. It doesn't come easy. It takes an incredible amount of self-discipline and self-sacrifice on our parts to love people, because there are a lot of people that aren't very lovable. Their lifestyles are different than us. Their choices are different than us. Their marriages look different. Their families look different. Their parents look different. And we just have this tremendous challenge to love people and to see what God sees. We just find that very difficult. So I just want you to know that I don't have all this fixed in my life. That's why I pray this over and over and over again, every day, multiple times a day. Give me eyes to see others as you see them, and grace and mercy towards them that overflows. I don't have all that fixed in my life. Maybe you do. Maybe this message is completely meaningless for you, and you say, man, Pastor, I had all this control. Thanks for the encouragement this morning. I know that I'm doing this just perfect. And maybe that's you. But I don't. And I know that for a lot of people, this is a real struggle. So I'm going to invite you to stand and to pick up that card that you were given. We're going to reverse the slide back to the previous one so you can read it off the card, you can read it off the screen, because I want us to do this out loud. There's something powerful about doing things out loud, about speaking it. Paul says in Romans 10:9 and 10 that if we confess Jesus as Lord with our mouth, if we confess with our mouth that Jesus is the Lord, that's part of the way that we begin to follow Jesus and keep following Jesus. So there's something about doing this orally, out loud. And I would encourage you to take this card and to read this prayer out loud. Read it out loud. So let's read this together. Give me the courage to love people and believe the best about others. Give me eyes to see others as you see them, and grace and mercy towards them that overflows. Amen. Now go and do likewise.